introductions, and it's wonderful to be back here in this lecture hall, where I've spent many years before. I was a student here, so it's really meaningful and special to be back here. For a number of reasons, actually. One is that I did a Panya route of my own some time back, when I kind of made a pivot. A Panya route is kind of a back route or pivot or detour, self-assembled kind of get around or bypass infrastructure. I made one of my own many years ago when I came here to study fine art, and some people in the audience will know that, and Frida knows that. Various people, I was a journalist before, and then I came into the art world and academic world again. So this is the site of my own shapeshift. And then also because when I was thinking about putting this body of work together, I came to a lecture here actually that Koyo gave, who at the time, she heads up Sites for Car, as you'll know now, but at the time she was heading up Raw Material Company, which is an independent art space in Senegal. And she was speaking about the value of independent art spaces and how they provide pathways towards understanding kind of Pan-African reality and forms that we should and could embrace somehow, because they produce these really exciting sort of canons and economies even, and that it's useful to kind of look to them for these new ideas, and that there's this kind of very interesting, productive work going on that's quite contagious. So that was also quite inspiring to listen to at that time. And then for another reason, which is also this, which you may recognize some of the images which occur early on in the book, which is part of the Peas Must Fall, Rose Must Fall event, an occupation called Ocean Garden, which happened on this campus, and some of the images are part of a visual essay that occur early in the book, which has a text companion, and you might wonder why, since it's a book that goes into other spaces and places on the continent. But it begins with a short visual and textual essay on an idea of common space, and this is a kind of emblematic moment that is a kind of positional statement, if you like, to offer my own understanding of an idea of public space as common space, which is a kind of a space that is belonging to nobody and to everybody, that is then contested and renegotiated and kind of performed new. And it becomes an important thing to an important element to have in the book up front, because a lot of the art that I go on to see in these other spaces and places happens to be in public space. So it wasn't planned that way, but because it's kind of imbricated into daily life, that becomes quite an important positional statement to have up front. So that's another reason why. And also because of this, always start from where you are. So that's a little phrase that I borrow from a lecture that Ngugi wa Thiong'o gave, also in Cape Town around 2017, I think it was. The topic was on decolonization, and his point that he was making was about using your own knowledge canons and languages and concepts and forms that are already circulating in public space, valorizing those and acknowledging those to understand what's going on around you. So because of that, I also start the book from where I am and go forwards from there. And that little echo carries throughout the book as just a kind of a little reminder. And these independent spaces, that's pretty much what they do. They kind of, one person described it to me as acting local but thinking global, so kind of taking the reference point of where one is and moving forwards from there. So just to step back slightly before I move forward into my whistle stop tour of the various spaces and explain a bit about where I went and what I saw and so forth, just to give a bit of context into where this work emerged from, which Edgar's already alluded to. Sometimes you think, the work that you're doing is entirely fresh and new, and then you come to realize that you're actually moving around in a spiral, and they're kind of one or two things that just keep re-emerging, and you're just revisiting them with new, fresh tools and ways of getting at them. This body of work that manifested in the first book, The Art of Public Space, that Edgar mentioned, was a project on public space. It was a global project that the Goethe Institute ran, and in Johannesburg it was called New Imaginaries. and it looked at, it was a project on walking and ambulatory thinking, another one on kind of new media and immersive technologies, and a third one on performance art. And there were two key things that came out of it for me. And one was this idea of common space that I really articulated. And the other one, because they were very performative and ephemeral, was just trying to get at a kind of question of value of why art matters that isn't instrumentalized. Because it couldn't be contained in that way, it became a question of articulating it outside of those parameters. Which led to that second body of work around August House, which was a building that was going to be was put up for sale, and the question became trying to manifest or articulate some of the artistic thinking and the contributions that this building and the work that was going on inside had made before it would disappear. As it so happened, it did actually get a second artistic life that was a little different to its first one, but how to kind of capture or to express some of that, and finding a way to do that, and it became a study in how artists dealt with uncertainty, because that building was in a state of limbo for a very long time. So what came out of that for me was really, that's just an articulation of this condition of middle space or uncertainty that the artists were dealing with. We all have to pack. One of the artists whose work was quite emblematic, I was following that body of work on each floor to see where the art went, what happened to the art, what happened to the artist, what happened to the building. This is his doors from August House, and then the same doors following to his new studio where he relocates. But more pointedly, one of his solutions was creating kind of stop-fell gallery mechanism in the new siting. And what came out of that project for me was this idea of, do these solidarity networks and these collaborative economies exist elsewhere, where artists are also dealing with very uncertain conditions or prevailing uncertainty and flux. And a lot of the cities that I go on to see are cities that are in these caught up in these fast accelerating changes, as Edgar also alluded to. And indeed, it does turn out to be quite common that these collaborative forms, these collective forms and collaborative economies are one big coping mechanism. So that the work emerged, the Panya Routes work emerged out of that. It was actually a project that I called plotform, like how does a platform start to form plots, or like coping mechanisms, if you like. And I'll show you in a minute where I went and what I did. And this is the contents page, so I'll just run through it briefly. The common space section I've already gone through, but the plotform working principles are the 5 working principles that I left out of reading across these spaces and seeing what they have in common. So the acknowledgement is that they're obviously very singular contexts, and that's respected, but the method, which I'll get to in a second, respects that fact, but holds as a starting point that there are certain things that are shared, certain historical conditions and so on, so there are challenges and some solutions that can be held in common. So it surfaces these principles out of that. The future forms chapter, I won't go into today just because of time, but it's basically taking those principles forward into various institutional contexts. I've got a paper coming out soon with Wits University. They held an artistic research conference recently where I take an art academy that one of the spaces has just self-built with their own curriculum and their own design and so on. I'll show you some images in a minute as kind of emblematic of some of the implications when you take forward this artistic thinking and these principles into institutional context and what that can do. So that's a kind of shortcut into the chapter. The backstage chapter is the method. So moving slow to go fast is a little quote from an artist who was kind of describing how they didn't have the kind of resources to do things in the way that would be ideal necessarily. You have to kind of take these sort of Panya routes. So you move maybe in a more cumbersome way, but it means that you can do things qualitatively differently, so that ultimately perhaps have more effect. So the plotform chapter of spaces as urban indicators is basically saying that because these spaces are operating in contexts that are fast accelerating and highly changeable, the independent spaces can be read as kind of urban indicators, and they I posit them as such anyway in that chapter. And then there's a little surprise ending. I won't get into that. You have to read the book to get that part. Those are the 5 spaces in the order of the fieldwork that I did. So let's take Accra for example. So I'd go to the Anno Institute of Art and Knowledge, and I'd visit at a time when they suggest that there's something that they're, some programming that they're putting on at that time that is emblematic in some way. So when I went, it was a mobile museum that I will show you. It's part of a kind of future museum project, trying to think about forms of museums and concepts of museum that's more applicable to that context. So not the sort of Western model. But I'd try to go at a time when something else was happening in the urban fabric that could act as a kind of counterpoint. So in Accra, it was the Shalewati Street Art Festival was happening at the same time, which is a kind of very multidisciplinary art festival, so that I would have a kind of counterpoint, because the way that I was, the method that I was using was to juxtapose the curatorial strategies in these spaces with everyday urban innovations, and kind of reading across that to surface these working principles. So that was more or less the method that I would use in each space. So these are the principles that I lifted out of those. The idea is that they occur in all of the spaces, but the way I'm going to run through them today at a whistle-stop pace is to align one principle with one space, but that's just for simplicity's sake. It doesn't work like that in practice. But, they all occur in all the spaces, and the way that I've written it up in the book is more complex, so that's why it's the most hefty chapter in the book, is because the way that I write it is to show how all these principles occur across all the spaces and kind of are interwoven and entangled. So speaking of method, this is just a sort of an installation from one of the book launches that sort of shows some of the fieldwork images that visualizes this approach of kind of urban scenes from the urban environment and some of the artworks juxtaposed next to one another. It's a method that I borrowed from Teresa Caldiero, who's an urbanist who works in South American cities, also taking a kind of multi-city approach. And I borrowed this method of juxtaposition from how she approaches those studies, because it's useful because it's not trying to make comparisons or kind of iron out differences or try to make straightforward similarities. And it allows for, the juxtaposition allows for resonances and dissonances to become apparent. And she also speaks about this process of auto-construction in cities of the South, which is a way that people build their own spaces with their own homes and basically cities by self-assembling incrementally and collectively over time when resources allow, and with very little help from the state, or when the state comes, it comes after the fact. And there's quite a lot of similarities in that process to the way that these independent spaces self-assemble. There's also very little state support, or actually no public support in terms of funding, so they have to assemble that from other sources. Here's an example of auto-construction down the road in Dunoon. So this is a new aspirant house over an RDP house, and it's just an image of aspiring and building incrementally over time as resources allow. So the first space, Go Down Art Space in Nairobi, is where the idea of the Panya Routes emerged. So Panya Routes is a route taken by Border motorbike taxi, which you can see on the one side, which is basically also a mobile artwork, because they pretty much adorn themselves as kind of moving art installations. And you can see it says wrong turn on the middle there, if you can make that out. But basically began as a kind of a way to move across borders. So it's spelled B-O-D-A, but it's a play on the word border, to get across borders or to kind of improvise a route. But I'm using it for the connotations of like bypass infrastructure or get around route. The signage on the other side was on the outside of an artist studio at the Go Down, Dickens Otieno, who uses kind of recycled materials in his artwork. Just making fun of the highway code. Like if you walk along the pavement and these motorbikes are just whizzing past, you know, everything just becomes a route. You know, it's basically just this making pathways out of whatever's available. So this idea of self-assembly comes through. The Go Down is, I went to the Go Down to overlap with the Naini Hu Festival, which is urban slang sheng for who is Nairobi. And it's a public art festival, but the important thing to draw from it is that it's curated by neighborhoods themselves. So there's a deferral of curatorship. There isn't a single curator governing things. It's the neighborhoods that decide what to do, how to do it, and so on. And it's a deferral. And it's not only in the curatorship that there's the principle of horizontality that comes out of that, but in the structure of the organization as well. The leadership rotates and that sort of thing. So, for instance, when I interviewed the Go Down for the research, 5 women came to that interview to talk about how the Go Down runs. So it's a very horizontal structure. So that festival, which happens every year, and it's quite there's a lot of complex things going on, feeds into a rebuild which is currently happening at the moment of the Go Down. So the middle image is just a screen grab of what the Go Down could look like in the future. It's undergoing one of the biggest cultural rebuilds in the country to re-envision itself as this iconic cultural space. At the moment it was in a warehouse space in an industrial part of town, but it's reimagined itself. It's been a long, several-year process, a collaborative process with artists and architects and community members and so on. And whatever goes on in the Public Art Festival directly has informed the ideas of the rebuild. And I won't go into the detail of that now, but the rebuild and the festival are very integrally related. And those two things in turn feed into the city, into formal urban processes, rethinking the city. So for instance, the master plan process of the city, they see themselves as stakeholders in the city and are informing other more formal processes of city making. So there's a complex nest of things going on there. This quote by a communications consultant for the Go Down is really just talking about how they see what they do as storytelling, and all the spaces in some shape or form refer to their work in that way. Sometimes also building counter-narratives was another way that it was described to me. The next space, Anno Institute in Accra. The middle image is this mobile museum. So what happened was I went to coincide with one leg of this project. And what it did was it took the architecture of an everyday kiosk, which is a trading structure. It could house a shop, a barber, you name it. It could even be a workshop or a studio. On the one side you can see an artist studio that's in a kiosk structure. But the point is that it's an everyday structure. It's accessible. In this case, it's porous. It's not intimidating. Everyone can relate to it, walk in and out. This particular one is designed to be mobile, so it's collapsible. And it went around the country to all the regions in Ghana and asked people it met along the way, what does art and culture mean to you? What would you like to see in a museum? How would you like to see it represented? Then it would come back to the Anno space, consider these replies, and then go back to the region that it visited and exhibit this reconsideration. And the quote over here is from a Future Museums exhibition that I was there to see the build-up towards it. That's in the actual Anno space. I'll show you a quote from it in a minute. This is just a different view of the Anno space with the mobile museum. This is one of the reconfigurations after one of these regional tours, taking the mobile museum back in an extended form to one of the regions that it had visited. this is inside the anno space. I just included this artwork because of the way that the artist, you can see a kind of a couple of human figures if you can make them out. Just the way that there's a kind of imbrication between the human figure and the ritualistic, and these are Akan symbols, and it's almost like a landscapey feel. And this imbrication of all these different things is quite typical of how art is kind of imbricated into different aspects of life. This is a mural by Nick O'Ware, whose studio you saw just now. And I included this. Okay, this is a journalist who it does exist, who goes, does investigations with this mask, beaded mask. And this is a kind of tribute to the journalist. But I included this image just because some of my method was also a bit of a Panya Route. I met Nick O'Ware because I took a little back route the one day, and then he took me down another route to show me this mural, which I wouldn't have found otherwise. So just as a kind of gesture towards saying that the Panya Route is also a valid method. And then this quote, which was part of that script around the Future Museums exhibition, just making the point about the dynamism, inclusivity, and participatory nature of cultural forms. That project was really just trying to get to grips with how do we think of museums structures or forms that can better basically give expression to cultural forms that are more dynamic and participatory. So the performativity principle comes out of this. And just one thing to say about that is that when I use the word performativity, I don't mean it in the popular way that you hear it described in political domain today, which is quite superficial and kind of, when you performative, doesn't have substance. I mean it in a linguistic sense. I borrow the idea of performatives from John Austin, who talks about certain words being performative, that when you utter them, they have the ability to not only describe something, but also to do something. So if you say, I bequeath, or I promise, or I do, or there's certain words that actually, when you utter them, they instantiate a new context. And I make an analogy from that to say, under certain circumstances, art can have that capacity to not only say something, but to do something as well. Cairo and Townhouse Gallery. I ended up seeing this exhibition in the gallery by Iman Ibrahim, but I didn't know what I was going to see before I went, and that is because townhouses, it's hard to appreciate it before you actually get there. It doesn't exist anymore, and I'll tell you now why. But it's so difficult to anticipate what's coming that the programming is hyper-responsive. It's in a situation of immense flux, and so they're unable to say what's going to happen next week or the week after, and the programming just responds to that. And I didn't know what I was going to see before I went, and the programming would just change continually in response to whatever was going on in the building, in the neighborhood, in the city, in the country, and it just had this hyper-responsivity, which was I could only really appreciate once I was there. And it was almost, the programming is almost overwhelmed by this intricate set of circumstances. Ultimately, it closed down shortly after I was there, after 21 years of operation, because of a very complicated set of dynamics that were partly political, partly financial, partly institutional, and a new gallery sprung up in its stead called Access Art Gallery. But it has quite a complicated history, including sort of building raids and collapses and so on. The challenges are also partly to do with the environment. So it's an independent space. There are not a lot of independent spaces and in more authoritarian contexts, these spaces have to push back. So the principle that comes out of this is elasticity, because there's you have to be very responsive to what's going on, but the underbelly of that is a kind of opacity and a refusal even sometimes to cope with these kinds of sets of circumstances. After it shut down, there was an exhibition, it was just a screen grab from it, that kind of dealt with the archival remnants and just saying goodbye to the building and the space. Something to note is that all these spaces have actually been in existence for 10 years or more, which is partly why I chose them. It's very unusual for independent spaces because it's quite hard to keep going when you're a non-profit kind of collaborative artist-led space. And so I thought if they've been going for longer than 10 years, they must have some kind of secret source, and partly why I chose these ones. I included this image. It's not from Townhouse, it's a neighboring space. It's the CIC, which is Contemporary Image Collective nearby in Cairo, but it was incubated in Townhouse in an annex, and then it found its own space. But its artistic director, Andrea Thel, described its interest to me as being interested in how art can intervene in other fields, in fields other than its own. And this exhibition that I had on at the time was doing exactly that. So even the title, This Is Not Water, it was about water, the social agency of water and political agency of water. And the very similar thing was described to me by Simon Njami, who was curating this something else, the Off Biennale in Cairo at the time. And they came up with the Off Biennale when the state shut down the official Biennale in 2010. As a kind of counter effort. And he said the value of independent spaces or independent art events like this is not so much about art. He said which seemed surprising to me until I thought about it. He said it's about an opportunity for exchange and dialogue and networking, because it's so hard logistically and in other ways to get around the continent, that these moments to come together and not to think of oneself as an island, and to have these moments to collaborate and so on. That's the value of it. So I thought that was quite important. And that's just the program managers explaining why, the hyper responsivity of what's going on inside the building to what's happening outside. Zoma Museum in Addis Ababa, so this Eliassim on the one side wearing the glasses, embedding some sculptures into a wall, and another builder making a wall. This museum is an artwork in itself, in its architecture. I was there just before it reopened. It had bought a new site and rebuilt itself, but it rebuilt itself using so-called vernacular architectures that go back hundreds of years. And so the principle that comes out for me is convergence, because it's taking past techniques, historical techniques, building them in the present tense, and then creating this very futuristic-looking museum that also challenges the idea of what a museum can be, as the same as we heard earlier. So, for instance, when it bought this site, it was polluted and so on, and rehabilitated it. There was also a nursery school on the site, and instead of telling the school, the kindergarten, to go somewhere else, it incorporated the school into the museum. So it's got a Zoma school now. It's a museum that runs a school, and then the school runs with ecological principles as well, and just kind of changes the definition of the museum. And this is Eliassim's artwork. I didn't see it in the flesh, but he was producing it at the same time. He uses recycled electrical components into large-scale artworks. I just thought it's interesting to see what he does in his studio practice. Julie Mekwetu is an Ethiopian-American artist. She spoke to us just before I did my field work. I was on a workshop, Africa's Concept and Method, and she addressed us about her practice. And she was also talking about convergence of time and space, and her artworks definitely get at that. She has this whole sophisticated kind of mapping technique that she does that gets at something very similar. And another artist whose work was at Addis Ababa University was also to me, showing convergence, but in a kind of urban typology sense. Mescrum is a curator who co-founded Zoma, just talking about the importance of not just how you begin a space, which is quite incremental and small scale, but also thinking about what how you put a structure in place for when the founders are no longer there. And just to say something about sustainability, because that comes up a lot in the different spaces. I came away with quite a different idea of sustainability from these spaces, which is not about like replicating into tomorrow what's happening today, but like thinking about how to think about a different, more equitable world tomorrow, and then build the institutions to make that happen today. So that's a different way of thinking about sustainability. And then the last space is the Fassi art space in Dar es Salaam, which is a principle of second chance. So it literally built itself from recycled shipping containers, and the artwork on the other side is also from recycled bits found on the beach. And when I was there, it was thinking about making itself an art academy, and it's since done that, and I've gone back to see that academy. And it's also from shipping containers, but it takes reference from a local market, the Karakou market, which has this elevated canopy and stairwell, and so does its design. As you can see, it's got the elevated canopy and stairwell. And it's also just taken its local context seriously in its curriculum. It's built its own curriculum, it's built its own infrastructure and so on. And it's I like to end with it because it combines all 5 principles in a really interesting way. And its former director, who's moved on since then, just this quote just kind of encapsulates the key challenge with these spaces, which is to kind of get a structure in place to kind of have some stability, but still be nimble and flexible and open. I think that's they all have to walk that kind of balancing act somehow. And this is my last image to end for some questions, if anyone has a question. This isn't in the book, but this is my fantasy dust jacket for my second edition when my first edition sells out. Ekran Adams, I'm sure you know his work. It's kind of a local Panya Route, I guess, because he does this mapping, these large-scale tapestries of routes on domestic flooring and also in the landscape. So this is between Bonteheuwel and Epping. They're paths that we make ourselves to get around designs that are made for us. So I think we all know these routes, we make them too. You probably traverse them in your own daily life. And I love the way that, I think his last exhibition was called Desire Lines. And I love the way that he transposes it with everyday materials and ropes and beads and twine, and makes something really beautiful and majestic out of that idea. So that's going to be my dust jacket. Thanks for hearing me out.
The idea is just Q&A, but we're intimate enough, so I don't need to moderate anything. So yes, I think people just want to ask questions.
Sure, yeah. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. I think we've got time. Yes? 10 minutes. I know it was a lot to throw at you.
The various art spaces, the funding models, when they vary or how do they impact on
Yeah, they do vary quite a bit, but I did find that so there's one section of the book where at length I actually just quote each director at length, because I found that their models were very interesting and also linked to their origin story quite a lot. So depending on how they had originated, their models tend to be quite linked to that whole ethos. But they were all shifting towards more local sources of funding and moving away from this idea of donor funding and foreign funding, and sometimes for political reasons as well. Like in some countries, the foreign funding was being cut off and so on, so partly it was pragmatic, but also just thinking, we need to vary the sources and have more local funding and just be more, so having a variety of funding sources. And also there's a big push to owning their own spaces. So a lot of them had been at the sharp end of having to suddenly move or losing their site, or so they wanted to secure their base basically. So that had become a priority where maybe it wasn't before. So I think getting more innovative about income streams, more diverse, and finding ways to generate more income. So it was almost like a 50-50 split, so like half generated on site and then half through donor funding, instead of being reliant on maybe one generous funder. But all of them, none of them had coming from the state.
I don't want to steal the opportunities from the students, but I'm very interested to know how you, if at all, your training at the Michaelis School of Art prepared you to receive the gift of your monographs. Or will you be able to have written the same kind of book apart from the training?
As a practitioner.
Yeah.
For book writing specifically.
Yeah, specifically.
I think it's a blend, because I was a journalist before I came to Michaelis. I think that helped me with that helps with the writing part, definitely. But it's a combination of things, because I think the observation thing is a big part of it, and having an artistic eye for things, and also having practice. When I go into spaces of practice, it makes a difference, having practice, and the things I'm looking out for, and the sensitivities and things. Those are not things that I would have had before I came, before I went through my artistic training, that you alert to different things. So I wouldn't have been able to write those books without that, going through that. I mean, it wouldn't, so this craft and skill of writing is one thing, but like what you're looking for and how you're approaching things, and your sensitivities, those are another thing. So I think it's a combination. Yeah, it's a combination.
What were some of the curriculum things that came out of the last space that you talked about?
The Nefasi curriculum.
Just that were interesting, that have influence into how they design them.
Yes, yeah. So a couple of things. So it's designed, it's questions led. So the artists themselves and the community came together and decided what questions and interests they wanted to pursue, and they called it questions-based curriculum. They had a couple of models that they looked at, that they then took a cue from, some other community-based curriculums that they looked around to see what they could take inspiration from. But they basically did it on a biennial design. So the first year, it's sort of contemporary art curriculum, and the second year is curatorship, and then when I say contemporary art, obviously those are both contemporary art, but the second year focuses on curatorship, and then it flips over again, so it's a 2-year thing. It's designed for students who haven't had a kind of contemporary art training before, so that's taken on board as well. And then it works through, I think there were 4 different things. So there's a theory component, there's a studio component, there's visiting, I don't want to say lectures, but visiting artists and practitioners, and then there's a kind of a mentorship thing as well. So they combine all those 4 different things. When I went, it was a public art module, and I went to contribute to that. And basically, all those things came into, it was a 2-week thing, and they combined it all. And the learners actually also ended up designing a work of public art and putting it out there. So it was quite it was quite practical in that sense. But it is self-designed, so they have and they put a lot of thought into how that will configure. So I think it is online. If you come to afterwards, I'll give you the content users. I think they put their curriculum online. I do. So I think it was a combination of the way that I fathomed the principles was by juxtaposing what I was seeing curatorially in the spaces with things that I was seeing in the urban fabric, and then sort of bringing those together. So it was all those things are already, happening and present in the spaces. So yes, I see them as, they are already evident in those spaces themselves in different ways, and those are that's made explicit. Those examples are made more explicit in the book itself. But yes, I do see those as being already manifesting in those spaces, yeah, curatorially and structurally, yeah. Yes.
I wanted to ask if there's been any of the spaces are really involved in the Has there ever been any effort to try to outmake the state intervene in such a way that it would create some national curriculum as well as just a fundamental sort of situation?
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Yeah. I think there is. It depends. So I think that, so each of the cities have very different contexts. I think it depends on which space. But so, for instance, the go down, there is actually quite a collaborative effort there between the go down and the state, and so they are actually engaged with the state, but more in terms of conversations about how urban policy and how go down can intervene in creating policy that's effective. And so they're definitely proactive about that, and they think that's very important to participate with the state and to be actively involved in those processes. And there is an effort there, but I think just in terms of funding, there just isn't capacity or resources. And then, like, in a very different context, there might be a bit of not antagonism, but because some of these spaces, there might be a difference politically, so sometimes it's a little awkward, so sometimes it's more difficult to engage because, it might not be, it might be a more authoritarian state, and you might actually want to keep a distance, so it depends on the context, yeah. But it is a tricky question because ultimately, you do want to, it's hard to exclude, you will exclude the state from these things. But in a way, they're sometimes filling a void, so there's to be a kind of public infrastructure and kind of filling a gap and creating infrastructures that perhaps the state might otherwise provide, but in these contexts and contexts are not providing. So, yeah.
In the kind of spirit of starting where you come from, or whatever that quote was.
Yes.
I just want to know about the decision not to. I know that there's probably a lot of discourse on this kind of thing in South Africa already, but the decision not to include South Johannesburg, for example.
Yeah. So I think just because it was really an effort to go elsewhere and see what was happening in other spaces and places. So it wasn't like a big, leave the country behind kind of thing, but rather just, I felt like I'd done a lot of studies in South Africa already, and it was time to move elsewhere to see what other spaces in other places on the continent might have to say that was, I'd done that study on August House, which was the Johannesburg study, so I felt it was time to move elsewhere and see, how relatable that context and condition was to other spaces on the continent. So specifically to move out of here, and so there is still holding the context in that first chapter that I mentioned, but then the point was to really move further afield and see what other things were going on and then relate that back. So I think it's just important to also move out onto the continent and see what else is going on and then bring that back and relate it back. Yeah.
And then just to follow on, guided your choice of those particular cities? So, you know, when I looked at it, I thought, okay, you know, we're going to see Dakar, for example, but I didn't see Dakar. So I was like, you know, or Kinshasa.
Yeah.
So I'm interested
yeah.
in what those brought for you that maybe those others had less of, or it was harder to access.
So it's always tricky. So in the same way that those spaces were constrained, we also had our own capacity constraints. I could only do 5.
Okay.
And then I did approach some that couldn't take me for their own reasons. So like Dakar, I did actually approach a space in Dakar that couldn't take me on at that time. So sometimes, I mean, these spaces are small, they run by 1 or 2 people. Sometimes you approach them and they're, sorry, it doesn't work out for this timing, whatever. And you have to respect that because you're another burden, another request, another person coming on, and it might just be bad timing. And in 2 or 3 spaces that I would really have loved to go to, there was one in Lagos as well that just couldn't, it didn't work out with that timing. So, you know, so be it. But in the end, I think the 5 that I got, you know, they're tip of the iceberg. You know, there's a lot of these spaces that are kind of flourishing at that time as well. And it was enough to get a reading to read across to say these are things held in common that are, you know, happening in other spaces too. So they're representative enough to make these common principles. You know, so in a way, you know, that's what I was trying to fathom. So long as they're spaces that are in cities that have certain qualities that I was looking for, which was like it's fast accelerating, really dynamic, fast changing cities with uncertainty and flux, and spaces were doing something interesting, dynamic. They've been around for long enough to have coping mechanisms in place, and they were, you know, they had a good programming hold, and they had the capacity to have me come and stay. Not all of them did. Then we worked it out between ourselves, and you know, they had constraints, I had constraints, and I came up with these 5. Well, it's not a perfect role, but those are the 5 that I managed in the end. Yeah.
So thanks for the questions and thanks for doing this presentation. And I guess just a note to say to the students that, you know, what struck me about this work is how little we know, right? So I mean, so the field is wide open for engaged, applied, concrete research, because, you know, to your point, you know, we really need these studies about dozens and dozens and dozens of more places. And the more empirical work we have, the easier it is to build African theorization that is really rooted, but also can kind of have a global impact. And so it's a wonderful moment to receive this work, because it's also a reminder that there's a lot to be done, and you know, this provides a great platform for that further thinking and engagement. So thanks, Kim, and again, Kirk and Jake, we appreciate the hospitality and the space and the time and the deep soundtrack.
Yeah. So just to say, on the Michaelis School of Fine Art, we've got more than 20 years of publishing catalogs for our graduate show. And this particular catalog comes with original artworks on the cover. So we save it for our most important guests. So in the anthropology of gift giving, we hope this is the start of a wonderful relationship. Please accept this on behalf of the school. Thank you.
Lucky me, I don't do anything like it.